This week we're going to talk about fish. So the next group of animals that we're going to be taking into account are the vertebrates known as fish. And there are two groups, bony fish and cartilaginous fish. We're going to start off by talking about bony fish. First of all, people who study fish are called ichthyologists. Bony fish make up about 95% of the known fish species. These fish are considered excellent sources of protein and have less fat. I've been on a diet on and off for literally more than half of my life. And fish has always been the best source of animal protein with less fat, less calories, more grams of protein per gram of food. And so I've always favored fish when I was on a diet. As I said, there are essentially two groups of fish. The bony fish, which are cold-blooded, which we know what that means. They are aquatic. They have fins and scales for the most part. They breathe by means of gills, and they have skeletons which are part or wholly made up of bone. There are about 29,000 species. Cartilaginous fish are also cold-blooded. They are also aquatic vertebrates. They have fins and scales, and they breathe by means of gills, but their skeleton is entirely made up of cartilage, and they account for about 1,300 species. And then a subclass under the cartilaginous group makes up what's known as lampreys and hagfish, and we will talk about each of these groups separately. So bony fish resemble other vertebrates in that they have an internal skeleton, an external skin, or an outer skin, and they have similar internal organs. They are suited for water. Just like birds are suited for flying, fish are suited to live in the water. And this includes the fact that they have fins instead of limbs, and gills instead of lungs. The regions of the fish are shown in this diagram. About the posterior part of the gill opening, or the operculum, and forward is the head. The intermediate aspect back into the urogenital opening is the trunk, and then from the urogenital opening to the back is called the tail. The head is made up of several features: the nostrils here, the teeth and mouth opening and throat here, the operculum, which covers the gills, and the gill opening, which is where the water exits after it goes through the mouth over the gills. It exits out the gill opening. They obviously have eyes. The trunk and tail. The trunk has multiple fins which are divided up and paired. The pectoral fins, which are shown right here. The pelvic fins, which are down here. Median fins, which are the dorsal medial fin, which is here. The anal median fin, which is here. And the caudal median fin, which is the back or the tail. Now, by median fin, what this means is that it's along the middle of the fish, and there's only one of them. So you have three of those: dorsal, anal, and caudal. And then you have paired fins, the pectoral and the pelvic, and these are paired, one on each side. The bony fish have skin and scales. And in between the skin and the scales are mucus cells, which produce a slimy mucus that makes the fish slippery and gives it its odor. It also makes the fish go through the water more easily. They have pigment cells called chromatophores, and they have scales, which are small bony plates on the skin which act as protection. They look much like shingles on the top of a house. The skeleton and muscles of the fish are shown here. This is an example of the skeleton, and what you can see is a prominent vertebral column, the cranium, which encloses the brain, and then multiple bony structures which support various parts of the fish. The pectoral girdle and the pelvic girdle are where muscles are attached for various operations. The pectoral girdle is where the pectoral muscles attach. The pelvic girdle is where the pelvic muscles attach. And they power the various fins, the pectoral fins and the pelvic fin. The muscles are important for voluntary muscle movement, whereas the digestive organs have a smooth muscle involuntary movement. And this is very much like all other mammals, where the flesh part, where the arms and legs, etc., have muscles that the animal can move voluntarily, whereas the digestive organs and various other internal organs will have involuntary muscles which work to move food along in the digestive tract. The heart has two chambers. In this diagram down here is the heart. This large red chamber is the ventricle, with the aorta coming out the back end here. And the blue section here is the atrium, with the sinus venosus collecting blood from the fish. And this back part of the heart is called the bulbus arteriosus. The front part is the ventricle, which pumps blood into this bulbus arteriosus, then which is ejected out through the ventral aorta. The myomeres are W-shaped bands that form the muscle, and each myomere is controlled by a separate nerve. Now, when we talk about human musculature, we're going to talk about motor units. And motor units are in the human what myomeres are in a fish. That is, each motor unit is controlled by a nerve. A myomere here is controlled by a nerve, and the W shape is specifically designed for the types of motion that a fish has to do in order to swim. The respiratory system of a fish is centered around the gills, and it's very simple in that the water is taken in through the mouth, flows over the gills. There's a gill arch, gill rakes, and filaments, which I'll describe in just a minute. The oxygen is extracted from the water through the gills, and then the water passes on out through the gill opening. So the arch is this cartilage part right here that holds the various aspects of the gill, and it holds it out so that the water can pass through. The filaments are two long narrow branches that come off the arch, and then the chamber, the gill chamber, is the area under the operculum where the gills reside. The rakes are vein-like structures that protect the gills from various particulate matter that comes through. And this diagram is similar to what we will be showing you when we look at the lungs of a human. We'll look at something, sacs where the air ends up, called the alveolus, and gas exchange occurs. Well, here what happens is the blood comes into this area, which is along here. The capillaries are thin-walled and allow for the passage of oxygen from the water into the blood, and at the same time there's a passage of carbon dioxide into the water out. And then the blood comes through, is oxygenated, and then comes out on the other side of the gill. So the passage of blood is fairly simple. The heart beats blood, deoxygenated blood, to the gills. The gills transfer oxygen to oxygenated blood. Oxygenated blood is then transferred through the systemic system into the blood, into the systemic area where oxygen is exchanged, and then comes back, blue representing deoxygenated blood, red representing oxygenated blood. And just for comparison, you have the bird, the mammal, and the amphibian, and you can see that it's a two-chambered heart versus a three-chambered heart versus a four-chambered heart. And the biggest difference here is in all three of these, you have two loops. One loop through the lungs, and then one loop through the systemic system and then back. And this also occurs in mammals and birds. Whereas in the fish, it's one single continuous loop. Still a closed system, meaning the blood always remains within the blood vessels. The digestive and excretory system of the fish generally eat one of two things. They either eat plankton-like material, which is water plants, or they eat flesh. And so there are a lot of fish that eat flesh. There are other fish that only eat plants. And each of these have different mouths depending on what they eat. The food then passes into the mouth, down the esophagus, and into the stomach. This story is very similar. Instead of the pyloric sphincter, there's an area called the pyloric ceca. And then ultimately the food passes, after it's been digested, it passes into the intestine for absorption and ultimately out the anus to be dispelled. The stomach of the fish is simple. It allows for the digestion of food. The intestine, as I said, is where the nutrients are absorbed. The pyloric ceca, which I mentioned before, are short extensions of the intestine that produce additional digestive juices. And here they are pictured here. They produce additional digestive material, and then the material goes into the intestine where it's absorbed. A spiral valve is a spiral divider in the intestine that acts the same way the ceca does. That is, it continually churns the food flow so that it is continually being broken down and then absorbed. And then lastly, the food comes to the end of its journey and then is expelled from the animal. The kidneys, which are shown up here, right here, are areas that filter the blood, and you'll notice that this ends up going out essentially in the same area as the anus for the excretion of liquid waste as well. The nervous system of a bony fish is fairly simple. They have a simple brain, very small. You'll notice again, as I've noted in the past, the brainstem is getting bigger relative to the rest of the brain. There's still a cerebrum, there's still optic and olfactory bulbs. This is the olfactory area, goes to the nostrils, and the optic that goes to the eye. But as we get simpler and simpler, the size of the brainstem and the sensory parts become bigger compared to the cerebrum or thinking part of the brain. Olfactory lobes are shown here and here. Here. The cerebrum, as noted, and the corpus callosum is the area of the brain that connects the right side of the brain to the left side of the brain and allows for crosstalk between the two halves of the brain. The optic lobes are important for the eyes, and again, compared to the rest of the brain function, the eye function is important, and therefore the optic lobes are large. The brain, the main part of the brain is separated into the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and under that is the medulla, or brainstem, and the cerebrum is what higher functions that a fish may have is centered in the cerebrum. The cerebellum is the coordination, and swimming requires a lot of coordination. And then the medulla oblongata is important for the basic functions like moving water through the heart function and so forth. Now there's a line that some fish have, not all, but most fish actually. And this line is called the lateral line. It goes down the lateral side of both sides of the body. And it's a special system that detects various things like turbulence, current, and pressure. The reproductive system of bony fish is simple. They have gonads that produce sperm and eggs. They have a urogenital opening, which is where, in addition to urine, it's where the eggs are dispelled in the female and the sperm is dispelled by the male. There's external fertilization, and the word spawn means to lay eggs, and the eggs themselves are called roe. And you'll hear people talk about this when they talk about caviar, because caviar is certain fishes' roe or eggs. The male sperm is called milt. And when a fish is born, you have a hatching of the eggs with the embryo, which looks very much like an adult fish. The egg itself has, much like a chicken or a bird, the egg itself has a yolk sac, which is a nutrient-filled sac that feeds the embryo until it's hatched. The young fish is called a fry. The last thing we'll talk about is some special organs that bony fish have. The one that's most commonly talked about is the swim bladder. This is a hollow-filled sac that functions to buoy or add buoyancy to the fish. This is why when the fish is alive, it can stop in the water and pretty much remain oriented properly. But after it dies, it begins to canter off, and that's because the swim bladder ceases to function. There are fish that actually have lung function in their swim bladder, and they're called the lungfish. Catfish, interestingly enough, use the swim bladder to produce a sound which can be heard by other catfish. There are some fish that live very deep in the water that actually can produce light, and then there are electricity generating organs that fish can use to jolt their prey.